Hey guys, Sly here, and welcome back to another episode of the Caspian Game Awards. Now, before we actually get into this, I need to preface that I was supposed to record this yesterday, but there were a lot of complications that were going around behind the scenes, and plus, this was a bit of a difficult list to research for me, or thing, like, for the show. And so because of that, I am gonna have to be very quick with this particular episode because, like, I'm gonna be in LA. Like, I literally have a bag right. I actually got two bags right there, with all my stuff. And so because of that, I need to make sure that, like, this isn't gonna be as long as some of the other ones. Because, my God, I need to make sure that I sleep because my flight leaves pretty early in the morning. So. But yeah, it's a whole thing. I am excited to see you guys in LA though, because of course I'll be going to Comic-Con, so I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah. So hopefully that'll be pretty fun. And yes, I'm going all 3 days, so hopefully things will be pretty fun there. But yeah. So, I think that's all I gotta really say about announcements, so I guess we can, sort of begin the episode. So, obviously, we're talking about the year 2000. So we've covered pretty much, like, and for those who don't know about the series before we actually get into the year 2000, this is basically me doing, like, my own Game Award show of every single year of, like, major year of gaming. I don't know if we're going to be going beyond 1995, but for sure we're going to be covering at least the second half of the 90s, and we'll just kind of figure everything else out from there. And we pretty much just kind of give out different categories and somewhat, which is a bit of a shame because, well, this is going to be the first time where we are not going to be having a best narrative or a best multiplayer category. So it's mostly because, well, multiplayer games were still pretty new by this point, and, well, video games quite weren't really narrative driven until I'd say around the mid 2000s, though we've been giving a lot of credit to a lot of games that have had narratives in the early 2000s a little bit. It's just this one's kind of going to be the only exception because, yeah, that idea of, like, good narratives in video games were just kind of few and far between. But rest assured, every other category, or most of every other category, will be acceptable for this point onwards. So do not fret. There's still going to be some decent categories. And, well, it's so weird because, again, we've covered every year from the 2000s. Like, I don't know, we've been through a huge journey just to get to this point. Because, like, the 2000s overall, I do think most people would consider to be the best decade for video games. And I think I have to wholeheartedly agree. Some of the best years for gaming, just period, we've covered throughout this entire show. 2001, 2007, 2005, 2009, hell, even some underrated years like 2003, or not 2000, well, yeah, I'd say that's a bit underrated, but 2002, like, it's been a pretty good run. And I don't know, it's just kind of weird, kind of, finally setting on that so that we can get closer to the 90s. And, well, as far as the year 2000 itself, like, as far as years in gaming, well,
not good.
I'm sorry, guys, but if I'm gonna be honest, this was a pretty bad year. And that sucks. Cause, like, and that's why it took me an entire extra day, because I had to triple check just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. But man, I'm not gonna lie. And it sucks for me to say it, but like, this year has got to be one of the worst years we're going to be covering in this entire show. Which kind of surprised me because I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about this year as in comparison to some of the, like, you know, either some of the greats, you know, 2007, 2005, 2004, a lot of people think is a really good year. 2002 and 1. And it's not even like as talked about as some years that are just straight up like hated, like 2006, or if we go into the 2010s, I know 2014 not a lot of people like, even though I don't think that year was that bad. 2017 is another one that comes up to mind. Obviously 2021 for very obvious reasons. So it really just kind of surprised me to just see how bad this year was. And keep in mind, this was the year of the launch of the PlayStation 2 as well. My baby console. Like, look at the shelf of PS2 games I own. Like, I love that console so much. And even just despite, I mean, it came out in like the latter half of the year, at least in North America. It was already in Japan, I think, in like March. But I gotta be honest, this is easily not only one of the worst, like easily the worst year of the 2000s we're going to be covering, but if I'm going to be honest, this is definitely the worst year that we're going to be covering since the 2015 list. It's that bad. I thought 2015 was a horrible year for gaming. And well, unfortunately, I gotta be truthful, there's a lot of parallels between this and 2015. Mostly due to the fact that there just straight up were not that many good games that I could find. And even some of the games that people liked, I gotta be honest, I am not a big fan of, like, at all. Like, which we'll get to that at the end of the show. But strap in, folks. Like, this one's gonna be a bumpy one. Now, I say all that because, well, doing my research, I just kept finding, like, just, granted, it shouldn't surprise you because, you know, this is, you know, this was a transitionary year. So, and I think we've established that most of the time, whenever there's a transitionary year, it's gonna be kind of eh. So, but it just felt like I was looking up constant, just mediocre movie licensed game, mediocre movie licensed game, and then mediocre movie licensed game over and over and over and over again. Not to mention that this was also the year of just straight up just video game disasters, including the infamous Daikatana. Like, so, yeah, as far as I'm concerned, this year was pretty bad. Like, even the launch titles of the PlayStation 2, with a few exceptions, which obviously we'll get into, even that couldn't save this. And, well, keep in mind, this was also the year that, like, the Dreamcast was just kind of a thing. And, well, there weren't really that many standout titles for it, except for one, which, again, we'll also get into in a little bit. But, man, it just felt like a lot of the games that came out this year just... So, strap in, folks, because we're about to go into about to get into a bumpy ride. So, but of course, before we get into that, we're gonna go over the rules, which I think I accidentally forgot to write down one particular thing, although it's not gonna be too necessary of a point. So, but yeah, let's damn it, this stupid. There we go. Sorry, the mouse just keeps doing that, where it keeps disappearing. But yeah, I did forget the last point. But all right, so as far as the rules are concerned, these are the rules that we'll be doing from this until the end of the show. So, rule number 1, just general nominee stuff. It must be a game released between January 1st and December 31st of that year. So, no weird cutoff points, because again,
don't yell at me, yell at the Grammys.
We're not the Grammys. So, none of that. Also, only 4 to 6 nominees allowed per category. So, we can't only have just 3, because, you know, that just kind of represents that was kind of just a crappy year for that category. And so, we'll just not have that category if that's the case. And also, we don't want to have too many nominees so that it bloats the list. Also, the initial release date is counted. So, if a game came out in North America in the year 2000, but it released in Japan in 1999, because there were a lot of those games, I triple checked to make sure that I was making sure that was correct. Yeah, we're not going to be counting those. We might count those for the 1999 list for next week, but as far as this, that's the only release that's going to matter, is the initial release, not just North American. And of course, only 1 game per franchise per nomination category, so there's that. As far as years for Game of the Year, it has to be a generally liked game for it to be accepted onto the list. Though, if absolutely necessary, I'll just start nominating games that I like. So, if it's a particularly really bad year, which, thankfully, this year wasn't, desperate like some of the other years that we talked about before, but it was kind of hard trying to figure that out. And, well, it has to be a completely new game, so no remakes or remasters allowed. Not that that's a big problem by this era, but there were still some remakes floating around. And, well, I'm only going to be choosing games that I'm interested in here, because I'm going to be honest, there were a lot of games that, I know a lot of people love, and even games that had debuts from the year 2000, from franchises that I do like, but I gotta be honest, I did not like them. We'll mention them in the honorable mention section at the end of the stream, because I know people are going to be hard-pressed that I didn't mention them, but there's a reason why I'm not doing it. So, but, man, this is going to be pretty bad. So, and, well, not even into the list itself, we've already got some problems. So, as you can tell, we already had to scrap. Shit. Okay, mouse. Fucking hell. Okay, Google needs to fix that shit. That's really pissing me off. But yeah, anyways. So, we already have some problems. Because, well, I could not find a single, I could not find enough games to represent the best game by new studio. Which sucks so bad. And what's worse is that I also couldn't find... Dude, I'm just gonna be frank. I could not find literally, more than, 2 platformers for this year. That's pretty bad. You have no idea how much of an indication that that's really bad. And I was even struggling trying to find some of the later categories that you see down below. Sports racing fighting games. I didn't know what to do. It was very thin, and I had to, here's the thing. I had to, go through, the category page on Wikipedia, which because the list of Wikipedia on the actual 2000 and video games list, it's not a complete list. It's only doing, notable games that's on that list. It doesn't account for, everything. I had to go into the category list of not only that, but also the list of PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, Dreamcast, N64. I had to basically just go into everything, and I barely found anything for this category. Same thing with the expansion category as well. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's because, maybe part of the reason why this year wasn't particularly great, maybe it's just the fact that it's not well documented, because, I mean, the further and further we're going to go away from the modern day, it's going to be harder for me to do the research, because not just on Wikipedia, it's pretty hard, but like even just looking up like a bunch of like gaming news websites, it's gonna get way harder for me to try to figure that out. So if I have to start gutting more categories, that's gonna be a problem. So maybe it's because gaming was not taken as seriously until around the mid 2000s, where this is becoming a problem. But as far as I'm concerned, this is going to be a bumpy one. So thankfully I was able to fill out a lot of the slots here, but let's just begin. So starting off with the action adventure category. So of course, action adventure, and horror games are included in this category. Weirdly enough, I'd say this is probably the best, like, as far as categories, this was actually the best for this year, which is kind of weird considering that, like, well, it's not too weird because, like, again, this was a transitionary year. Like, 6th generation consoles were just kicking into the scene. With the PlayStation 2, and the Dreamcast came out a year prior. And so I'd say these are probably like the best choices that I could have done. But what did I end up choosing? Well, so yeah, I'm not gonna lie, some of these names you guys probably don't know. But let me reassure you that these were pretty big names. But look, let's start with, like, I'd say the names that most people recognize. So let's start with Resident Evil Code Veronica. This originally released on the Dreamcast, so I guess this is technically making an exception. Although it was ported to pretty much like, PlayStation 2. I think there was a GameCube port as well. So, and this was the kind of the first major spin-off for Resident Evil. There was Resident Evil Survivor, but that game sucked. So this, as far as like, being, that kind of was bridging the gap between Resident Evil 3 and 4. And as far as like just kind of being like the last of, okay, technically not the last, because I know Resident Evil 0 and the Resident Evil Remake came out later. But as far as like being like the last like big game of the classic era of Resident Evil, unless you count 0, but whatever. It was a decent sort of, storyline. So I don't know, I don't really have much else to say about it, because it's like, a lot of people love Code Veronica, and it was just kind of the last of that era. So I wanted to at least give it a nod. So now, rest assured, though. Now, I will admit, I was very tentative with adding this next game to the list, because if you guys know me, I cannot stand timer mechanics. I just find them annoying. It's arbitrary difficulty, and it just stresses me out more than it should. I play games to release my stress, not to add to it. And, well, let's just say that Majora's Mask, being the direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, was a pretty hyped up game because of how massively successful that game was. And so to have a game that was the first direct follow-up game in the Zelda series was a big deal. I know technically Zelda 2 kind of was a loose, but it's not really like explicitly directly related. This game is to Ocarina of Time. So And, this game had a kind of a cool, creepy atmosphere. Like, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, the moon most people know of is one of the creepiest goddamn things that have ever been made in a kid's game. Like, and I don't know, this game just has a cool, like, foreboding tone to it that not a lot of Zelda games kind of have. The only other game I can think of that has something similar is probably Twilight Princess. So, and yeah, like, I think this game, at least as far as like an art direction standpoint and like a narrative standpoint, it's definitely why I'm nominating here. Gameplay wise, that's kind of where it starts getting iffy because, well, again, the 3-day like time limit mechanic is probably the thing that's kind of making me a bit icky with this game. But I'm willing to at least give credit where credit is due for, maturing the Zelda series a bit more. Or at least as much as it could by this point, because this was still, I think, a rated E10 game as opposed to rated teen, which is why I really like Twilight Princess. But I mean, go watch the 2006 episode if you want more on that. And then, last but not least, as far as like major name recognized games, we've got Dynasty Warriors, and in this case, Dynasty Warriors 2. So this is the first PlayStation 2 game we're going to be talking about here. And I mentioned this loosely, but I'm not going to lie. Don't get it twisted. I love the PlayStation 2. It's the console that like basically made me who I am now. I wouldn't have gotten into gaming as much as I do now if it weren't for, a big chunk of the games that you see on that shelf that are from that console. But people do tend to forget that the launch titles for the PlayStation 2 were very mixed at best, with a few exceptions. And thankfully, this is one of those exceptions. Especially since this moved away from the original fighting game formula that the first game had, and it went for more of a just general, like, hack and slash sort of, open battle thing, which was so fun, especially for the time. Like, and, it got to showcase a little bit of like what the PlayStation 2 was capable of. Even though it admittedly does still kind of feel like a PlayStation 1 game, like, you can definitely at least tell that, like, there was a bit of an improvement because, the PlayStation 1 for sure wouldn't have been able to handle the hundreds of character models that you see on screen. So, and, I don't know, this game was definitely a benchmarker for a lot of games that would eventually come later down the line. And just help define the Warriors franchise from this point onwards. So, I feel like I had to nominate it on that respect. So, but now let's move on to some of the more obscure games. And as I mean obscure, I mean games that I wouldn't necessarily say are like household names, but are still pretty big for their time. Take, for instance, Thief 2, The Metal Age, the direct sequel to 1998's Thief, which I remember playing a few years ago, but it just dragged on for way too long. I like the game, but it is definitely not streamer friendly. Do not play Thief 1 thinking that it's going to be short. It's not. And, well, this game basically tried to slow things, like, it basically tried to pick up the pace a little bit by, like, removing a lot of the weird sections and focus solely on the stealth. And that this game exceeds on its stealth mechanics. I love stealth games, and I have nothing but, praise as far as the stealth mechanics in this game. It is so fun just sneaking around a bunch of like guards in this like steampunk fantasy setting. And, you have tons of tools at your disposal, like the different arrow types and the camera and stuff like that. It really does make for a pretty cool, just pseudo espionage / thieving experience. So, and it helps that it's a fantasy setting. So, obviously I would nominate it. But also, a bit of an underrated gem right here. We've got ourselves this game called Rune. So this isn't okay. Thief was a PC game. This is also a PC game, of course. Dreamcast for Code Veronica, and then Zelda for N64. Let's throw in another PC game in here, Rune. So this one, it's more of like a general, just kind of beat 'em up hack and slash, like, but not in the ways of Dynasty Warriors 2. It honestly kind of like feels in some ways like a precursor to something like a God of War, like in a weird sense. Like, I mean, you know, it has also, weirdly enough, quite a few platforming bits, but thankfully, because it is a third-person game, you know, I think it actually works pretty decently, especially for PC platforming. PC, like, in platforming, like, people don't really think about, so yeah, like, but it's not a platformer, it's still an action-adventure. But yeah, as far as, like, you know, strict, you know, action-adventure games that, you know, have a bit more of like a, you know, Norse Viking look, I'd recommend you guys check it out. Especially since this was, you know, this was pre-Skyrim, like, so, you know, this was before that sort of look was starting to become a bit oversaturated for a while. So if you want something like that, I'd give it a recommendation. And then last but not least, we got ourselves American McGee's Alice, which, you know, for those who don't know, American McGee actually used to work at id Software. He was, you know, he was very involved with Wolfenstein, Doom, and Quake's development. And so, you know, after him and John Carmack, after both of them left id, they just kind of went to do their own things. Unfortunately, John Carmack went, like, or no, it was John Romero. God, those two fucking names. But basically, American McGee, he went on to make his own studio, and he wanted to make his own twisted version of Alice in Wonderland, which is the game that we got in here, which, honestly, I think is pretty cool. So, John Romero, he went on to make Daikatana, and, well, you know how that turned out. But American McGee ended up working on this, and as far as being kind of a cool, like, you know, more true to form version of Alice in Wonderland, because people forget the original version of Alice in Wonderland is still pretty fucked up. I don't think it's a grim fairy tale, but like, it at least took a lot of cues from that. And so just kind of taking cues from the original source material and just kind of making it his own sort of like thing, adding in like even some elements from some of the games that he entered, like specifically Quake, like a lot of those like sort of Cthulhu-esque sort of things, making it a bit more grim looking. I think this game is pretty unique in that regard. So I wanted to at least give it a nod for that. So let's go over the winner. Yep, I got the. Yeah, I got them here. All right, so here we go. With the mouse doesn't be okay. There we go. All right, so the award for the best action adventure game of the year 2000 goes to Thief 2: The Metal Age. So I could have gone with Code Veronica, and I could have gone with Majora's Mask, but I'm gonna give the underdog the win here, because you guys know I love stealth games, so like I am a little bit biased here, but this one's a pretty good one, especially if you want one in first person. So the biggest thing for me about this game is that it improved a lot of the mechanics by basically removing the worst parts of the first game. Because I'm not gonna lie, whenever I first played the original game, it took way too long to do missions. Like, it honestly really did drag on. And while, yes, some of the missions can still take, you know, quite some time in this, thankfully, you know, it's due to how they, tweaked the combat a little bit and removed the god-awful, fucking, like, the zombie sections. Because, I don't know, they wanted to be like Resident Evil or something with the first game. And it just did not work. They removed those weird action sequences and focused solely on the stealth gameplay. Because, it's a stealth game. And it works wonders. And as I mentioned earlier, it added in some new arrow types. It added in like a cool camera to where you can actually sort of have a better angle of exactly where you're going into certain areas. Because again, it's steampunk. Which, of course, even though like some people would argue that this game is not as detailed as the original Thief, I would argue that, the fact that it is still set in that, steampunk fantasy setting, I think it still works. And, well, because of all that, it's considered by many to be one of the best stealth games of all time. And, up there with Metal Gear Solid as far as influence. So, I recommend you guys check out Thief 2. I'd also recommend you guys check out some of the other games in the Thief series. Just make sure you understand that Thief 1 is a long game, especially for the 1998. But that's a story for another time. But let's move on to role-playing games. So, once you guys see this list, you guys are going to be screaming at the top of your lungs. You guys are going to be screaming at the top of your lungs, being like, oh my god, you didn't nominate this game. I'll explain it at the end of the stream. Because there's one game that I know a lot of people love from this year that qualifies for best, like that in a lot of people's mind qualifies for best role-playing game. But I'm gonna be honest, because of its just straight up awful shooting mechanics and just straight up, very dated like design, I just could not in good faith recommend it. But thankfully, I was still able to find actually quite a few RPGs that qualify that I think are way better than that as far as Control, and I find to be pretty cool in their own regard. So whether it's on PC or console. So, but let's see what I ended up choosing. So, we've got ourselves, honestly, quite a few JRPGs. Like, surprisingly enough, the year 2000 was actually a pretty decent year for JRPGs. Like, if you were a JRPG fan, the year 2000 was a very damn good year for you guys. So, but let's go in order of like how I have it this time. So, let's start with the non-JRPG that's on this list. Diablo 2. So, again, I know Blizzard sucks. Blizzard's lame. They're stupid. They don't know how to like make games that like actually appeal to gamers nowadays. And they've just been getting worse and worse every year. But as I mentioned in some of our previous episodes, let's not forget that they were at the top of their game and have produced some of the most iconic games of all time. And just straight up some of the best games, period. Diablo 2 being one of those games. Like, and I do kind of have a weird history with this, because I do actually remember playing this game. It was like a long time ago, but like, I think it like back in the late 2000s, like long ago. My cousins were playing this game because, they wanted to get into Diablo. And, they thought it was pretty cool. And I think the game itself is cool as well. Granted, does it take from like a lot of like, the isometric 90s RPGs that were popular around that time? Yes. But what made this game at least stand out compared to most other games was the fact that Diablo was more of a dungeon crawler. And I think I mentioned this before, but I really do like dungeon crawler style of games that are not roguelikes. Thankfully, this predates, roguelikes, and it's not a roguelike, so therefore, I think this game's pretty cool. And, just kind of the general, like, hellish, dark fantasy, horror, borderline, like, tone, I think really does make this game, stand out compared to its competition. Which, speaking of competition, my god, there are a ton of JRPGs that were on this list. I think actually technically every single one of these games is a JRPG, if I'm not mistaken. So I'll double check that. But first, let's talk about Persona 2, Eternal Punishment, which this one's kind of a weird one because this is technically not like Persona 2 proper. It's technically the second half, but it is a separate game. It's not an expansion pack or anything like that. It's its own, basically like continuation of the first Persona 2 like part, which was only released in Japan in 1999 at the time. So this was just kind of thrown at the very, very end of, the year 2000 in the States on the PlayStation 1. And basically was the groundwork for, the other Persona games. And hell, I've even seen some people they say this is their favorite Persona game, and that it's even better than 5. Which I'm not gonna get into that debate. You guys can debate that for yourselves. I'm just here to nominate games. But yeah, no, as far as more top-down JRPGs are concerned, this one definitely took itself way more seriously than the first Persona game. And so, in that respect, I would definitely recommend you guys check it out, especially if you want, kind of a bit of a fusion of a lot of, PC games and JRPGs at the time. But then I've also got myself a bit of a curveball here. We got ourselves the original Paper Mario, which I didn't think it was released this year, but I think it was released in Japan in the year 2000. First, before it released in North America. Yeah, it released in Japan in the year 2000. Therefore, it counts for this. And, well, I mean, it was seen as the spiritual successor to Super Mario RPG. And, being a game that was presented in a more, slide puppet show format, it didn't take itself seriously. It was a breath of fresh air as far as, RPGs are concerned. Because most RPGs took themselves very, very seriously. I mean, just look at the covers of most of these. And so to have one that was more contemporary, but also a bit more lighthearted, and also on the N64, because the N64 was absent of RPGs. That was a good call. And then we've got ourselves Dragon Quest VII, which, if I'm not mistaken, it's technically not the first Dragon Quest to be released in the States, because, there were all the Dragon Quest games that were released in North America, but they were called Dragon Warrior. I think this was the first game in the States that was released where they just straight up called it, oh no, never mind, they still called it Dragon Warrior, but they didn't release the other versions in the States quite yet. It was complicated. It was the same problem that Final Fantasy had, which we'll get to that in a second, but yeah, as far as I mean, it's Dragon Quest, if you like Dragon Quest, you're most likely going to like this game. It's going to have very similar systems as, both that and Final Fantasy. So, that's all I got to really say about it. So go check it out. And, well, we've got ourselves Final Fantasy IX. Speaking of Final Fantasy. So, Final Fantasy IX... funny enough, again, this one's kind of a weird story. Because, I mean, this was the last of the PlayStation 1 Final Fantasy games. And it's weird because like people had issues with this game because it wasn't because the art direction wasn't like as quote unquote serious as the previous games. Even though it's only really like the the sprite, like the not the sprite, the it's mostly like the cutscene character models that aren't like they're not like the in-game stuff, like they're not like the same as the in-game. I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm trying to say. Basically, people didn't like the fact that like this was more of a cartoony look compared to Final Fantasy 7 and 8. So, but I think it's more of a stylistic choice, and I do kind of like it. And I also do like how they went back to a proper fantasy setting with this game because this is the like because every game since Final Fantasy 6 was more on the sci-fi, side of things. So to have a game that was back to its roots, hell, even bringing back the the black like the black wizard type, like that's or black mage, excuse me, dark mage, whatever the fuck they're called. I like how they went back to like the original like design philosophy of like the first 3 Final Fantasy games. There, I said it. So, and I do think that the game is still cool regardless, even if people see it as like kind of a just kind of like a middle game in between bigger releases, which obviously Final Fantasy X would be that big one. So, if you like something that's a bit more just true to fantasy, but like doesn't take itself like too seriously, but seriously enough, Final Fantasy VIII's for you. And then last but not least, Saimori would be crying if I did not mention one of his favorite games of all time. And that's of course the original Dark Cloud. So is this a JRPG? I think it is, but I'm gonna triple check. Yes, it is. Okay. So again, this was a funny enough, this is actually this was kind of Sony's attempt at like kind of making their own exclusive fantasy series. Yeah, they had the Final Fantasy series throughout the late 90s, and obviously they have 9 here, but they kind of wanted to do their own thing for the PlayStation 2. And so they conceived this. And, it's a decent little, like, action RPG. And so because it's an action RPG, it's a lot more faster paced compared to your Final Fantasies at the time. Bit more faster paced than your Dragon Quests. And, because of that, I do think that it, at least helps it stand out compared to its competition. So, but let's go over the winner. So, oh boy. People might... I feel like with this category, no matter what, people are going to be upset with what I'm going to choose. Because, like, even though I do think that, like... okay. Whatever. Let's do it. So, the award for the best role-playing game of the year 2000 goes to Diablo 2. There are some people that are going to be mad with me with this one. Not just because of Blizzard, but also this is the only non-JRPG game that's here. But I guess it just really goes to show just how much of a damn good game Diablo 2 is. Because, again, it's a dungeon crawler. I like dungeon crawlers. I know I haven't streamed as many as I... Actually, I don't think I've streamed a single one. It's kind of like XCOM, where it's like, I love that style of gameplay, but I just haven't streamed it for you guys. I really want to someday, but, who knows. But it's a fun dungeon crawler. But what made this game also stand out is the fact that there were tons like of character classes, but also different types of builds within those classes themselves that you can set up to make it to where you can play however you want in the game. You weren't restricted to like the specific type of class that like you weren't tied to like the specific like gameplay style of like other classes, because admittedly, if you chose a class in a lot of like RPGs, they had basically one gameplay style and that was it. Diablo 2 really stuck itself out by allowing you to still have a like choose like a main class, but have like options for you to be able to do alternative ways of being able to play the game, which allows for so much more flexibility through going through these different levels. And I think it works in spades for this game. And of course, you know, this game has an amazing atmosphere to it. Again, the sort of like, you know, dark fantasy look I think is pretty cool. And well, I'd say as far as like, you know, the way in which enemies spawn and the bosses, it's actually pretty balanced, in my opinion. And well, I gotta say it. Like, you know, I think I said the same thing for Warcraft 3, but you could argue that this is Blizzard's the best game that Blizzard has ever made. Like, you know, some people might prefer the RTS style. Some people might prefer this more action RPG dungeon crawler style. But I'm not gonna lie, this is a pretty good game, and I recommend you guys seek out a copy if you guys can. Just make sure it's not the remake, because granted that's not as bad as the Warcraft 3 remake, but yeah. All right, let's move on to shooter games, which again, there's multiple different games that people are going to be mad that I'm not nominating, but I don't care, because literally just yesterday I was trying those games out, and frankly I just could not stand them. But I'll explain that again, repeat after me, at the end of the stream. So what games do I have here? Huh. Interesting selection. I'm not gonna lie, though. There are two games on here that I am very tentative about. Those being Siphon Filter 2 and Turok 3. Because, I mean, one was made for the PlayStation 1, Siphon Filter 2. And the other one was made for the N64, being Turok 3. Although, to be fair, I'm judging that one more so off the PC port, because I actually think the PC port's actually pretty decent for Turok 3. But I guess it just comes from the fact that, like, the games, well, they got decent reviews. You know, Siphon Filter 2 obviously being, you know, continuing off of the third-person shooting that the first game had, and, you know, improving the visuals and the general, you know, control schemes of the game. And Turok 3, of course, being what was supposed to be like the finale of like the Turok trilogy of essentially, you know, console Quake clones for the N64. Like they were, you know, they were solid continuations of their respective franchises, but they weren't as well received. And I don't know, it just kind of like, I was kind of debating on whether or not I wanted to even nominate them here, because I do like them. You know, Turok 3, although to be fair, it was kind of moving away from the Quake, you know, level design of like the first two games. It kind of tried to do more of its own thing. And Siphon Filter 2, of course, leaned away from the stealth sections and focused more on just the third-person shooting. I don't know, like those are those are tentative for sure. So don't think that those are going to be choices that I would have like for sure on here. I just wanted to at least give them a nod. However, all the other games I do think for sure qualify. Let's start with Soldier of Fortune, which, funny enough, is a Quake clone, which we've talked about this game like several times before. It's essentially a Quake clone, but set in but basically just a modern military shooter, which is kind of funny nowadays because if that were to release today, people would get mad. But this was the early 2000s Quake style of games, retro shooters, boomer shooters, if you want to call them that. I hate that term. But like that style of game was still popular, even in the early 2000s. And well, this game is a lot of fun. It is violent as hell. It's even like for the time, it actually got into a lot of controversy because of the dynamic it got a lot of flack because of the way in which you can shoot off individual limbs off of enemies, which I mean, yeah, you could say that that could be seen as tacky, although I could make a counterpoint that that led to a lot of the systems of a lot of the levels of violence that we see. I'm not promoting violence, by the way, when I say this. In the context of Doom and Quake clones, it helped pave the way for a lot of the more over-the-top violence that we would see in games like Doom, in the 2016 Doom and Doom Eternal, as well as a bunch of other games that came out before then. So, granted, it is also, of course, the further we go along, the further we're gonna go away from the modern time, the more and more questionable the look at the games are going to be. But I still think this game is still pretty fun. If you just see it as a precursor, a predecessor to something like Call of Duty, then I think you can at least appreciate it. And then, well, speaking of precursor to Call of Duty, we got ourselves Medal of Honor Underground, which, yes, this is actually a sequel. It is not an expansion pack. They explicitly labeled this as a sequel to 1999's Medal of Honor. And this game is cool. It basically just kind of continued a lot of the gameplay of that first game, but done with a different protagonist, having it set also in places like Morocco and Greece. Though it does have a weird Wolfenstein-y level where you fight a bunch of German knights, despite the fact that the first game was touted for how grounded it was for a PlayStation 1 game. This game basically didn't take itself as seriously in that regard. But I still think this game is pretty fun. Especially the stealth sections that are in this game. So, if you want a decent console shooter, Medal of Honor Underground, not a bad choice. Which, going back to stealth, we've got ourselves another sort of, forgotten classic, The Operative No One Lives Forever. A sort of, 1960s spy-inspired first-person shooter, which, funny enough, feels way more contemporary compared to a lot of other games on this list, and even some of the ones in the honorable nods. Because, I don't know, it was just kind of weird playing this, because it was a lot more structured than I was thinking. Because, you know how, like, a lot of shooter games in, like, the mid to late 2000s, they have, like, a bit of a structure to them where, it, like, you don't just run and gun. You've got, like, different objectives you have to do. Sometimes you have to, like, stand still to take out enemies. Sometimes you have to, you know, like, defuse a bomb. Sometimes you have to go through, like, even in some games, you even have to stealth some sections. Well, funny enough, this was one of the first games that kind of basically made that the norm. And, you know, it's helped by the fact that this game has a pretty cool, like, it has, like, a unique 50s, 60s, I guess not 50s, like late 60s, early 70s, you know, spy look, as it's heavily inspired by both James Bond and I guarantee you Austin Powers as well. And it just goes all at it. And this was made by Monolith, same people who made Fear. So a little bit of a DNA, you know, from this game was thrown into that game. And yeah, I think it's a pretty cool game. And it sucks that it's not available online, or at least not, like, you know, in legit ways. Pull up a hook for this game. And then last but not least, funny enough, I'm going to nominate the original Counter-Strike. So, I'm not huge into Counter-Strike as a whole, but I do respect the original Counter-Strike, as it was one of the first, you know, fully multiplayer tactical shooters. And yes, Counter-Strike is a tactical shooter. I know some people argue otherwise, but like, you know, you still have team coordination. It's a modern military setting. You have 1 life per round, which was the same thing as Rainbow Six, like a year in 2 years prior. It's a tactical shooter. And for basically being one of the first games to popularize it, and be the first game to popularize it in a multiplayer setting, I have to at least give it some credit. And I mean, even just like playing this with bots, I know the game doesn't actually have bots. You have to, like, there's mods with that add in bot support, but playing with that was actually some of the most fun I've had in a multiplayer game in a while. Which was weird, because, like, again, this is, like, I don't care for Counter-Strike as much, but I do respect this game for doing that. So, I don't know. If you want to play, like, this game, but you can't find lobbies, go find, like, that Counter-Strike bot mod. You'll have, like, a bit of fun, surprisingly enough. But let's go over the winner. So, which, it can go any way, I feel like, with this one. Because, again, this year, well, yes, there was definitely some solid shooters that came out. I wouldn't say that this was, like, a definitive year for shooters. Some people would, but, well, some of those games I don't like. So let's do it. So, the award for the best shooter game of the year 2000 goes to Soldier of Fortune. It's kind of weird giving the win to this game, especially since it's like, I don't think I've given a single Call of Duty game the win for the best shooter category. And I compare both of them because, well, Raven Software would eventually work on, like, they would eventually be put into work with Call of Duty, and, like, a lot of the over-the-top action of those games actually was inspired from this game. So obviously those games directly came from Medal of Honor, but they took some of the more, like some of the elements from this and its sequel and applied it to those. And so it's kind of, in a weird way, kind of an important game. And, well, it's helped by its, you know, gunplay, which it's very meaty And when people say that, it's like very like, the guns are loud and they have like, decent to high damage output, which, adds to the satisfying gameplay. And well, since this was a Quake clone essentially, but also a military shooter, it basically just combined both aspects into one game. Like, it's kind of weird thinking that like this game is still in the same lineage as, your Doom and Quakes, but also having some elements from other games that came around that scene, like Rainbow Six and Medal of Honor. Like, again, the early 2000s was just kind of a weird transitionary period between that old school level design and the level design of a lot of shooters that we know nowadays. Like, but it leads for a cool combination, at least. So, and of course, yes, I couldn't remember the name of it, the dismemberment system. I apologize if I didn't know what I was talking about. That's what I was talking, like, that was a pretty big deal as far as like, in-game, I guess, physics technically. And, however you feel about it or not, it would eventually lead to a lot of the, dismemberment system that we see in a lot of, more recent games. The modern Doom games come to mind, but also games like Ultra Kill and Dusk and, other games like that. And so, yeah, in a weird sense, this game's kind of important in a lot of ways. I mean, it also helps that this game has tons of different locations you go to. You go to all across the world. You go to New York, you go to Europe, you go to the Middle East, you go to Africa, you go to Latin America. I think you go to Russia and like East Asia for a few missions. So it goes all across the world. Very similar to Call of Duty. So yeah, like, and I guess the one thing that is holding this game back is, well, again, this is a game from the early 2000s, and so there might be some imagery that might be a bit weird, especially in the Iraq missions, which is even more foreboding because this is pre-Iraq war. But if you just look at it at like, if you just look at it as just, a game where you're just taking down a bunch of terrorists and you don't just kind of like, see it as like, potentially a piece of like, military recruitment, as much as I hate to say it, but that's by like the late 90s, that was kind of starting to become a thing with some shooter games. But if you try to separate that stuff, it's a decent time. So, again, I like shooter games, but like, if you guys know me, I am like the most anti-war person ever. So, but whatever. Anyways, let's not get into that conversation. Let's go into the sim strategy category, which this was kind of a hard one to figure out. I really had to dig deep for this one. Though, some of the picks that are on here, you guys might actually be surprised about. And I was even surprised about it too. So, what did I end up choosing? Well, the original Sims came out this year. So, Goldie is happy. He's happy that I mentioned it. I will say, it's not my favorite Sims. It has its problems. It's in that isometric view that a lot of PC games were doing. And while I like that for city builders, for life sims like this, it's just not my thing in comparison. But I do want to at least give it a nod, especially since we've been giving a lot of attention to the Sims in general. And, well, this is the beginning of that. Like, and I do think that as far as more casual, more laid back, more lighthearted, and just more kind of, non-war / conflict related games, it has its place. And I do think that overall, yeah, no, The Sims 1 honestly has a lot of merit to it. So go check it out. But let's go back to the war side. God, that's terrible. Let's go to another launch title for the PlayStation 2. A turn-based strategy game known as Caspian. Which, I guess I'm nominating this one because this is basically a spiritual successor to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms game series that Koei was doing throughout the late 80s and throughout the 90s. This was kind of their feudal Japan equivalent. And, well, funny enough, it does even have some, loose references to some of the characters from Dynasty Warriors 1 and 2. So, but yeah, if you want like a console turn-based strategy game, Caspian's actually not too bad. Like, it's grand strategy, so of course it's going to be big. But yeah, not too shabby. And then we've got ourselves Ring of Red, which, funny enough, like, I haven't heard of this game until doing research. I eventually got myself a copy of the game, and like again, it's a bit more of an obscure, like, turn-based tactics sort of game. So, like, again, it's an XCOM style, kind of, but I like that style. So, of course, I wanted to at least give it a nod. So, as far as being one of the, one of those games, go check it out. Granted, it was originally, this was a PlayStation 2 launch title as well, so, yeah. By the way, yes, I know I keep nominating a few PS2 launch titles, but I gotta tell you guys, these are the exceptions. Because let me remind you, the PS2 launched with, I think, 26 games in North America. These are truly the exceptions. So, and technically, I don't even think this was technically a launch title in North America. Yeah, it wasn't. So, it was released in North America in 2001, but it was released in Japan in 2000. So, it technically doesn't even count for North America. So, but what does count is Homeworld Cataclysm, which I thought this was an expansion. But no, apparently it's listed as its own fully fleshed out game. So, which, fair. I mean, it has a completely different campaign, and, some of the factions are different. So, it makes sense. And, I mean, Homeworld, pretty important as far as RTS games are concerned. The first 3D RTS series, at least to my knowledge. And, just kind of being for being a gap release in between major releases, between Homeworld 1 and 2, it's a decent experience. Like, so if you like the more RTS style, like if you like RTS games that are a bit more space oriented, Homeworld Cataclysm is for you. Which, speaking of RTS games, Command & Conquer Red Alert 2, the game with the new metal soundtrack. Because year 2000, Hybrid Theory, Papa Roach's Infest, Disturbed Sickness, even though those guys are assholes now, but I'm not getting into that. Like, this was the new metal era, and that's reflective of the soundtrack here. There's other tracks that are different genres, but, like, that's definitely, like, the main Hell's March 2 is goddamn. But yeah, like, obviously besides that, this game was also pretty big in the aspect of making the factions more distinct between each other, which I think was a net positive. So, if you want a continuation of the first Red Alert, where it basically does World War III in an alternate timeline, there you go. But last but not least, I wanted to give a quick nod to the original Europa Universalis. I really wanted to have the, like, if the best game by new studio category would have been a thing, I would have actually nominated this. Because, like, this was Paradox's first big breakout title, which is insane to think about. Granted, it was much bigger in Europe than it was in the United States, but it was still big regardless. Because as far as grand strategy games are concerned, this is the grandfather of pretty much all of the popular ones that are, like, all the popular ones nowadays. Obviously, Europa Universalis 4, it should be no surprise, but also Hearts of Iron. And so if you like that style of grand strategy, well, it's definitely going to be, it's going to feel very different from those games because mechanics they didn't have as many big mechanics in comparison. You might like this game. So go try to seek it out if you guys can. But let's go over the winner. So, which again, there's a couple of games that you guys can probably debate on which one's going to win, but I mean, the slideshow's already made, so of course I'm going to have to do this. So, the award for the best sim strategy game of the year 2000 goes to Command & Conquer Red Alert 2. Yeah. I think overall, out of all the games that are on here, this one's the one that, in my opinion, has aged the best. And, well, there's some people who swear that this is the best Command & Conquer game. And I don't know if I agree with that, but it's easily, like, you know, one that, like, I do think is very important. Because this game made it, like, basically made it to where the game, it's like the factions themselves were way more distinct than they were before. Because a lot of Command and Conquer games before this, well, yes, you, like, with the Tiberium games, you obviously have, you know, the Global Defense Initiative, and then you have the Brotherhood of Nod. Those are just the two main factions of those games. And then with Red Alert, you have basically like a evolved, like, NATO equivalent, versus the Soviet Union. But, like, the factions, you know, they typically just kind of had the same units. They had the same, you know, they had the same infantry. They had the same ground vehicles. They had the same air vehicles. Like, they were just kind of samey feeling. But this game made it to where the units themselves were way more distinct overall. And distinct as in, like, not only did they look visually different, but they also played very differently, which adds for a ton of gameplay variety. As well, yes, the units of the Soviet Union deal out more damage. The units of, I'm just going to say America, they basically were a lot more faster and could gather resources faster. So it was balanced to where it was more, you know, it was more complementary on their strengths and weaknesses, which I think makes for engaging gameplay. And also, of course, you know, the campaign itself, I'd say playing the missions themselves are pretty good. Obviously, this game had the really cheesy FOV cutscenes, but I digress. But also the UI, funny enough, I think is actually pretty clean in this game. Like, granted, all Command & Conquer games, I'd say, all have pretty good UI, but, like, in this one, this game in particular does have pretty cool, like, pretty good UI. I don't know, just the red, I think, complements the gameplay so much. You don't really see a lot of UI in RTS games use red. I don't know. But also, of course, I already mentioned it earlier, this game's soundtrack is pretty peak, of obviously using a lot of, like, you know, new metal, electronic music, basically just a lot of the music styles that were popular at the time. So that's cool. Also, co-op missions. This game introduced that. And, well, as a bit of a bonus, this game has tons of mod support, so if you guys want, you guys can check that out. But, alright. The sports and racing category and the fighting category. This one was pretty hard. I'm not gonna lie. this was pretty rough to try to get enough for this. Because everything just... I kept trying to find reviews. There were so many games that were in like the 50 and 60% range. There were so many games that just straight up did not look good. And I'm not just talking about like, sports games. The racing category, same exact thing. And I could barely find anything. I didn't even find anything in the fighting category. Like, it was slim margins trying to figure out what was good. It was awful, to say the least. But, well, this is what I came up with. And one of them I feel like is technically cheating, but that's how dire I was with this particular category. Like, I mean, it's kind of pathetic, I feel like. Okay, but let's start with the positives. So, again, at least we got 4. And, well, you know what? People were probably wondering, hey, you didn't nominate Mario Tennis for any things. Why didn't you do that? Well, this is your guys' excuse. This is my excuse to finally acknowledge Mario Tennis. But I guess I'm just kind of iffy with Mario Tennis because I just don't know if I like the idea of, video game or cartoon characters being like in sports settings, other than like kart games. I don't know. After watching like Space Jam, which I know people meme on it, but like after seeing that, I just realized, yeah, I don't like seeing cartoon characters or video game characters in sports settings. So, yeah. But this one's at least a decent time as far as like, being kind of a pseudo successor to the Mario Tennis game that was funny enough on the virtual boy of all things, excuse me. This one I think was fine. It's not offensive. It's decent. But let's move on to Need for Speed with Porsche Unleashed, which is pretty funny because they really did make it a game specifically dedicated to Porsches, which I didn't even think that was going to be a thing with Need for Speed. And unfortunately means that they're never going to release this game on Steam in particular. But Need for Speed, obviously, I've been starting to get into a lot of racing games. Need for Speed definitely being one of those series. And I do think that this game is decent enough. It's not my favorite Need for Speed. So, I don't know. It's more on the basic side. It's still street racing, but it doesn't really have as many cop chases. So it doesn't really stand out to me as much as like the Hot Pursuit games or Most Wanted or any of that stuff. So it's fine. And then we got ourselves Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, aka apparently the second best video game of all time, apparently. At least according to Metacritic. I'm sorry. That's still really funny to me. But not because this is a bad game, because it's not. Although, again, 2-minute time limit. You guys know me, I hate time limits. But, like, the actual gameplay it's fine. Like, it can still be pretty fun. But why the hell is this, like, the second best game on that website? I don't get it. I genuinely don't get it. Hold on. Critic, best video games. I don't know. I've always been a critic of like their best games of all time list. Like, but God, that is so okay. It's no longer It's no longer technically the best game of okay. It did go down a few slots. It looks like. Where is it now? I know it's still somewhere pretty high. But, like, I don't know. it's a decent game, but like it's not the best sports game ever made. I'm smiling because it's like it's just so weird. It's like, why do they have it so high? Like I don't know, it's weird. But well, speaking of weird, I'll go to be fair, it's not the weirdest game. Driver 2, which this game is technically cheating. Because it's not like a traditional racing game per se. You know, and I feel like by extension, you know, us talking about the other driver games was also technically cheating. But like, you know, it's a game where, you know, you're mostly in your car anyways. Like, the only time that they actually tried going outside of your car was Drift 3R, and that ended up being a disaster. So, as far as, like, basically being, like, a light racer game, especially one that, like, you know, was for the PlayStation 1, I think it's actually pretty fun. Like, I don't know. It's a decent little you know, car game. And again, this is just showing how desperate I was with this list. God, this sport again, I had to take like 3 days just for this category alone. It was so bad. It was so bad trying to research this. Let's move on to the winner. So, all right. Best sports racing fighting game of the year 2000. Driver 2. I know this game is technically cheating. But it's easily the best game in this list, in my opinion. It's not even close. Like, come on, man. Like, I mean, it basically improved. Like, the only thing that it did not improve, you know, compared to the first driver game is the graphics. The graphics are a bit inferior, like, compared to the first game. But, it makes up, it's worth it, because this game does have, you know, way better controls, at least in my opinion, compared to the first game. Easily drives, you know, as smooth as butter. Maybe not as butter because, you know, PlayStation 1, but as smooth as a PlayStation 1 game can be. That, and also, this game surprisingly has some pretty good cop chases. Like, I was kind of surprised whenever I was just kind of experimenting with this game. And yeah, like, you know, the cops were very responsive. Like, and, you know, very similarly to Need for Speed Hot Pursuit that came out a few years prior, you know, it actually is very exhilarating whenever they try to, like, stop you. And of course, you know, it's a bit more narrative driven, as well, no pun intended. It's more of a narrative based story compared to a lot of your other car games for the time. And while it's not like the most amazing sort of story, if you want something with a bit more of a reason as to why you're driving around, it's a decent, like, you know, entryway. And, well, you know, the fact that you go throughout different, you know, areas as well, I think it helps. And, well, because this is more of an action car game, it also has undercover missions, because you're playing as like a pseudo cop. And so I think that you know, gameplay variety really does make this game stand out. Again, I know this game is cheating. I know this game is technically cheating because it's technically not a racing game, but I don't care. Like, it's enough of a racing game that I'm willing to give it the win. So, again, that's how dire this year was for me. God. So, let's move on to expansions, which, thankfully, you know, yeah, again, this, okay, well, thankfully, we're almost to the end. We got 3 more categories. But again, this was just kind of a hard one. Although, to be fair, I think in this category's defense, this one's just more so just, bad documentation rather than like there not being enough expansions. 'Cause it took me a long time to try to remember and just try to figure out what games that were not released that year had expansion packs. Which, well, thankfully, there's just enough. But the problem is that it's about 50-50 as far as to like what we've got here. So first of all, we've got ourselves Roller Coaster Tycoon's Loopy Landscapes, which pretty much, expansion pack 2 Roller Coaster Tycoon, pretty decent business simulator. And it basically just adds in, several more scenarios that you can finish, as well as tons of new ride options for you to add into your theme parks. Again, nothing that like really reinvents the wheel, but just some more light, just a lot more just kind of stuff for you to mess around with. So that's cool. Rainbow Six Rogue Spear also received multiple expansions. It received 3 expansions, which is insane. 2 of which came out in the year 2000, and then the other one came out in 2001. But I ended up choosing Covert Ops over, I think it was Urban Ops was the first expansion. So the reason why I ended up choosing this one was because not only did it it may have added in less like missions per se, but it added in a lot of weirdly enough, it added in a few missions that were designated that were straight up just mill sim missions. Which, I mean, Rainbow Six obviously kind of went into simulation territory, being a tactical shooter and all. But this game really, but this expansion pack, basically just kind of, had a built-in tutorial for, special ops missions, which is just really bizarre. It's cool. You don't really get a lot of, training, military, sort of, training stuff like that in games. Although that's probably, there's a reason for that, probably. I don't know. I thought it was kind of cool. And the missions themselves, I think, are pretty cool regardless, so I wanted to give it a nod. Although, to be fair, if this isn't satisfying enough for people, then, just replace this with Urban Ops, and it's perfectly fine. I just can't choose both of them. But then we've got ourselves the ones that I know for a fact people are definitely happy that I have on here. We got ourselves Age of Empires 2, The Conquerors, which, of course, expansion to the legendary Age of Empires 2. Adds in the Aztecs, the Mongols, and the, adds in some more Viking stuff. And adds in campaigns for them. And, well, since it added in more factions, adds in more variety for Age of Empires, which was already pretty diverse RTS to begin with. And last but not least, we got ourselves Quake 3 Team Arena, which basically just doubled the content that was in Quake 3, which Quake 3 already had a ton already added in a ton of content, and so therefore having this with a loose I think it has a loose campaign in it, I think is pretty cool. Since I actually really like Quake 3's gameplay. So even if it's more multiplayer oriented than story driven, you can still play with bots. So at the end of the day, it's still pretty cool. So let's go over the winner. So again, I'm trying to speed things up a little bit because again, I gotta sleep early. So I apologize if I'm being pedantic, but anyways. So the best expansion for the year 2000 goes to Quake 3 Team Arena. Again, like, it may not be like the most exciting content in the world, but you know, it adds in tons of maps, like 20 new maps, which is insane. It also adds in a lot of the guns that were originally in the first few Quake games. Like the nail gun was surprisingly absent in the base version of Quake 3. They brought it back. Proximity launcher they also brought in, as well as a chain gun. They also added in, I think, like 6 or 7 different power-ups. And, well, the popular Capture the Flag mode was brought into this game, which, I mean, was a classic back in the day. I know Capture the Flag may not be the most popular mode nowadays, but I like Capture the Flag. I kind of wish it was in more games, like more like modern like shooter games. You know, obviously, you know, I think Halo Infinite still has, like, they have their Capture the Flag mode, so it's at least still like a thing. But yeah, it's definitely, I guess this is kind of reflecting on just, you know, the age of gaming that like I am more interested in, I guess. So, but still, I do think that this is an overall good expansion for an already pretty damn good shooter game. So, all right, art direction. Now, if I remember correctly, I didn't actually technically finish this, so don't worry. I'll probably add in games as we go along here. But it's mostly going to be games that we talked about, but with 2 new ones. So obviously I'm adding in Diablo 2 because it has a really cool sort of hellish look. And I'm also adding in No One Lives Forever for its like cool 60s, 70s spy look. But I also wanted to give a nod to games that I unfortunately did not have enough room to like add because, well, you know. So Jet Set Radio, which part of me is kind of kicking myself because I forgot about Jet Set Radio Future for 2002, slight spoilers. But the original Jet Set Radio, being the other big Dreamcast game, I think needs no introduction. I mean, just look at that, like, yeah, it's very, very, very 2000s looking, but it was one of the earliest games that utilized cel-shaded graphics, which I think makes the game really stand out. Even if, like, you know, it may not be your exact jam, I had to at least, like, give it a best art direction nod, because it's a very, very, very unique game for its time, as far as its looks. And yeah, I think the game actually does look pretty cool. But I also wanted to give, you know, art direction to Spyro, You're the Dragon. Because unfortunately we did not have a platformer category. I had to at least the little boy, like, or the little dragon boy, get at least something. Because it's like, man, there are so many games that, like, I just could not find as far as platforms. Everything was just a mediocre to just straight up garbage movie licensed or just, you know, cartoon licensed platformer that just did not really jive well. So, but Spyro You're the Dragon, you know, has a pretty cool, you know, sort of cartoon fantasy look that obviously I grew up more with the first 2 games, but it's still it's pretty much still the same style. And it's just a style that I like. You know, there's a reason why I really do like my boy Spyro. Because Spyro, I'm sorry. Also, it's funny that, like, they use, like, on the logo that they use, like, a dragon similar to the Mortal Kombat dragon. Yes, that's actually on the cover of the North American version, by the way. That's not an edited version. They actually used a Mortal Kombat dragon for Spyro 3. I don't know why, but they did. But before we actually nominate a winner, I'm actually going to triple check to make sure that there's going to be, like, if there's any other game that, like, maybe I missed that I want to add best art direction to. I guess there's one game, I guess. Okay, actually, technically, okay, two. We're gonna add two more games for this because I think it's only fair. So, granted, I usually like to have them organized by like day of release, but I'm going to make an exception here because I'm too lazy, and well, that, and also I'm starting to run out of time. So, but I'm gonna give a nod to Final Fantasy IX and American McGee's Alice. Final Fantasy IX, of course, going back to its more, fantasy roots, basically just having the look of the original 3 Final Fantasy games and putting it into 3D, which is a style that I do like. And, well, American McGee's Alice for its sort of macabre, twisted, dark fantasy, fairy tale look that it really tried to like hammer down home. So I think that's only fair, and I think most people are going to agree with these picks. So let's move on to the winner. So the award for the best art direction of the year 2000 goes to Jet Set Radio. Again, the one Dreamcast game. The one Dreamcast game that really did make that console stand out. And unfortunately, this thing for the longest time was stuck to that console until they finally released it on PC. And also, I'm pretty sure on other consoles. It's a damn shame that like it was stuck on there, because it has one of the most unique visuals that I've seen for a game. Like, again, that it has like that sort of like comic book manga sort of look. I mean, yeah, it's very, very, very much, inspired by like, manga. And yes, it's very much that late 90s to early 2000s sort of, I call it graffiti punk because I don't know what else to call it. It's basically just that sort of very specific late 90s to early 2000s sort of basically like, Japanese mixed with like skater culture look that like was very popular that like no one talks about. It's a very specific look, but if you see it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I'd say like something else that's very much of that is, funny enough, honestly, the cover of Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory in a weird way. Like it's a very, very specific look, but like it was a thing. It was a thing in the 2000s and late 90s, I guess. Like, I don't know. I'd have to like maybe I'll add like a wiki page for that on my wiki, but like it's a very specific style, but it's a style that is pretty cool. I mean, I'd say like the closest thing that honestly, like at least the closest modern day equivalent to something like this, honestly, I would say is probably Hi-Fi Rush. That's like the closest thing. It's not exactly that, but like, which, I mean, speaking of, well, this game walked so that a game like Hi-Fi Rush could run. I can guarantee you that. They are very similar, like aesthetic-wise, and even like in some instances gameplay-wise. And this game, I don't know if it's exactly the first, but it's easily one of the first games that used a cel-shaded look. And, well, I mean, I think it works in spades for a lot of games. So go check it out if you guys haven't already. Even if you aren't like into that more skater sort of, action sort of like gameplay loop, you will at least appreciate the visuals. By the way, this game is not a platformer. I don't know why Wikipedia is calling it a platformer. It's not a platformer. By definition, it's not. So, again, Wikipedia calls too many things platformers. But we got ourselves the final award for tonight, the Game of the Year. So, again, we went through this faster in comparison to some of the other lists that we've done. But again, that should just, again, that should just really tell you guys that this was not a good year. It really wasn't. If I'm going to be honest, this is easily one of the worst years in gaming history. Because, holy shit, this was bad. But, thankfully, we've got ourselves some pretty good choices, I feel like, as far as the winners are concerned. And I think most people are going to understand at least where I'm coming from. So, I'm going to nominate Thief 2 for its fantastic stealth mechanics, improving upon the first game, and just being overall one of the best stealth games ever made. Soldier of Fortune for being a pretty, action-oriented shooter game that really did stand out, compared to the rest of the crowd. Some people might argue Counter-Strike should be there, but for me personally, as someone who's more of a single-player person, I'm going to nominate this. Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, though, obviously most people are going to agree with that, and for good reason, as it is still a pretty unique-looking Zelda game, and, tells a pretty grim story. So, yeah. Diablo 2 for its very addicting dungeon crawling mechanics, and it's really fleshed. Okay. Are we back online? Okay. Let me check.
Are we back online?
Okay, thank God. Holy shit, that scared the shit out of me. Cause I don't know what happened. The stream just straight up just disconnected. So that would have pissed me off so much. Cause we're literally at the end. So okay. I don't know when it disconnected, so I'm just gonna repeat what I just said about all of these games. So I think it disconnected whenever I was talking about Diablo. So okay. So let me just okay. Okay. So let's all right. Game of the year for the year 2000. I think most people are going to agree with these choices. Thief 2 for its fantastic stealth mechanics. Soldier of Fortune for being honestly a pretty underrated shooter game. I know people would probably prefer Counter-Strike, but for me personally, I am going to say this game because I'm more of a single player person, and I just think that the overall shooting mechanics are actually pretty fun. Majora's Mask for being, a bit more of a grim take on Zelda, being a direct continuation of Ocarina of Time, and, just kind of having a bit of a foreboding atmosphere while continuing a lot of the gameplay stuff that game had. Diablo 2 for being a pretty fantastic dungeon crawler style of RPG with a lot of freedom as far as being able to create your own class, or not create your own class, but using classes with flexibility. Red Alert 2 for being a fantastic RTS game with pretty good sound design and balanced gameplay. And then Spyro Year of the Dragon for being kind of a last hurrah for the PlayStation 1. Even though I think this game technically came out after the PS2's launch, but still being, a fantastic, end to an era for PlayStation. So, but yeah, I'm gonna make sure that I announce this real quick because Yeah, I am not. Yeah, so here we go. The last award of the night. Hopefully the internet doesn't disconnect again. So I'm gonna do it now. Because I don't like, I'm running out of time. So, alright. So, the titular game of the year 2000. The last award of the night goes to Spyro Year of the Dragon. So, this was the last hurrah for the PlayStation 1. And it's pretty ironic that we ended up choosing a PlayStation 1 game to represent the game of the year as opposed to a PlayStation 2 game. Although, to be fair, you know, a lot of people would have ended up choosing a PlayStation 4 game over a PlayStation 5 game for Game of the Year for 2020. But I guess some things don't change. But why do I end up choosing this game? Because, yes, this is the one Spyro game I did not grow up with. But, truthfully, it's because of just what this game represents. Just the culmination of everything that was built up for that console. But as far as being a platformer game, it has a variety of characters you can play as, other than Spyro himself. Because, obviously, you've got Bentley there, not related to Sly Cooper. I wish, but this was 2 years before. Shayla the Kangaroo. As well as the other... I'm sorry. I did not grow up with this game as much. I do sincerely apologize. But you get the point, is that, like, this game, ultimately, was just... You know, it basically expanded a lot of the gameplay variety. It basically expanded upon gameplay variety. With the use of its different characters. And, well, this game... Yeah, like, challenge modes were in the previous Spyro games, but, like, they were way better in this game overall. Like, they were way more... like, they weren't just strictly time-based. They were a lot more just kind of, you know... pace-based, if that makes sense. It's not, like, there's a difference between time-based and pace-based. Pace-based is basically when the clock is going up and not going down. And it's based off of just, you know, your skill at the different challenges that they provide. Which is a much better way in which you actually do a challenge mode. It's also helped by the fact that, like, you've got yourselves some pretty iconic music. And I feel bad because I don't remember the other name, the characters. Again, I was lightly touching around Year of the Dragon, which I feel so bad for. But, like, even you know, the Sorceress being, you know, a pretty decent villain to go up against. You know, you could argue that Nasty Nork and Ripto are better, but Sorceress is still there. And yeah, just kind of, you know, Blanca being a character that, like, kind of learns to kind of change throughout the story. I think it's actually pretty like heartwarming, especially for a kid's game. And, well, due to all the combination above, it has the best gameplay in the series. And you could argue that even despite its late release, you can make a good case that this is the best game on the PlayStation 1. I know a lot of people would love to say, you know, one of the Crash Bandicoots is definitely one of the best. Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, Silent Hill, although to be fair, Silent Hill 1 is definitely up there. I do think that overall Spyro Year of the Dragon is a good representative of the PlayStation 1. And, you know, despite the fact that, like, it was released right around the time when the PlayStation 2 came out in North America, I think it was easily worth it. So, which, let me look up that, because I know it did come out, like, around that same... Okay, it didn't come out after. It came out 2 weeks before the PlayStation 2 in North America. It was already in Japan in March, like, since March. So, that is insane. But that's of course the game of the year. And well, let's recap, shall we? Because this was a bit of a scuffed mess. So, best action adventure, of course, went to Thief 2. Best RPG went to Diablo 2. Best shooter game went to Soldier of Fortune. Best sim strategy went to Red Alert 2. Best sports game went to Driver 2. I know, a lot of 2s. Best expansion went to Quake 3. Best art direction went to Jet Set Radio. And the game of the year went to Spyro, Year of the Dragon. As far as my personal top 10 favorites, in no particular order, we've got ourselves Resident Evil Code Veronica, Thief 2, Red Alert 2, Spyro Year of the Dragon, Final Fantasy 9, Soldier of Fortune, Diablo 2, Medal of Honor Underground, Dynasty Warriors 2, and The Operative No One Lives Forever. And I'm going to give out some honorable mentions here. It's not going to be a long list, so because again, this year was just not very good, in my opinion. I'm going to give an honorable mention to, well, a guilty pleasure mention to Crash Bash. I know it's not the greatest game, and the challenge mode is pretty dumb, but like, I like the concept of like a party-based Crash game. Also, guilty pleasure, admittedly, Dino Crisis 2. It's a dumb survival horror game. I know, but I just can't help but like just find it pretty fun. Like, I don't know, Dino Crisis is just a series that like not a lot of people take seriously, but it's just dumb fun. But a game that is a genuine honorable mention, Tenchu 2. If it wasn't Thief, it was going to be this game. So, and this game is still pretty fun. So if you want like a PS1 stealth game that isn't Metal Gear, there you go. Medieval 2, also a pretty fun action-adventure game. That unfortunately did not get a remake. It's the game preceded it did, but this didn't, so it might be hard to try to find a copy. Escape from Monkey Island, of course, continuing off the narrative beats of the Monkey Island series. Slip Heap being kind of a more obscure strategy game that, you know, I think is pretty cool. And I was tentative about Time Splitters being an honorable mention because I do have massive problems with the original Time Splitters. But because of, you know, the fact that you can literally create your own maps in the multiplayer, and the fact that you can at least, you know, unlock all the characters in game, because this is the era, this is like an era literally like, you know, 13 years before the microtransaction era, I'll give it a pass. So, but yeah, those are the guilty pleasures / honorable mentions. Now, that being said, there are plenty of games that I know people are screaming at the top of their lungs that I did not even give an honorable mention to. Those games being Deus Ex, Perfect Dark, Banjo-Tooie, Shogun Total War, and Hitman Codename 47. I think those are the main 5. I know, as far as Deus Ex, and as far as Hitman's concerned, and Total War, those are franchises that I do love, if not at least like. But I gotta be real with you guys. With those 5 games, because I know those games a lot of people love. But okay, let me check to make sure that like there's another game, because maybe there's something I'm forgetting. Oh yeah, and Baldur's Gate 2 as well. That's another one. I guess 6 games right there. I'm sorry, but like, I did not like any of those games. I'm sorry. Like, let me explain for each individual one, first of all. Which, by the way, I'm gonna, click over here. So, for Perfect Dark, go watch our, first, the best FPS tier list that we did. Like, granted, I will say, The Xbox 360 version of that game is definitely better than the original. Which, well... I'm sorry, the N64 controller sucks. Don't at me. But, yeah, I'm sorry. Like, I just don't... I like the setting and I like the tone. I just can't stand the gameplay. Like, it just is so janky. At least on that original N64 version. I hated the N64 version. The Xbox 360 version I do think is much better. Which, I know that version got shut down because of the stupid fucking Xbox 360 thing shut down. But thankfully it's on the Rare Replay collection. So, for the Xbox One / Series consoles. So, it's not lost media, thankfully. So, at least I have hope. So... But as far as Deus Ex, Total War, and Hitman Coding 47 is concerned, I'm sorry, but I just think that those games aren't just good at all. God, this is not going to be a popular stream. Like, again, in that same video I did with the FPS tier list, which, by the way, Deus Ex is technically not an FPS, it's an RPG. Again, I like the setting and I like the story. I just hate the gameplay. It has aged so bad. Again, it's the same reason why I'm not a big fan of, like, the Elder Scrolls games pre-Oblivion. It's that everything is based off dice rolls and random chance, including shooting your gun. A mechanic that in a turn-based RPG works, but in an action RPG, it's a terrible mechanic. So, and I will argue that to my grave. So, because of, like, that bullshit, I just cannot, in good faith, I just couldn't in good faith nominate that game. And as for Shogun Total War, again, I like that game, or I like Total War, but again, I just did not like the gameplay. Like, you know, it's also a game that, like, I don't even know if I'm even playing the game right. Because, like, I try to, like, you know, put my units in each, like, square. But then it just doesn't do anything. I don't know. The old, like, Shogun 1 and Medieval 1 are just so awkward to try to figure out. Like, I don't know. Start with Rome Total War. And just skip Medieval 1 and just play Medieval 2. Same thing with Shogun 1. Just play it Shogun 2. Infinitely better. And as for Hitman Codename 47, in our Hitman tier list, this is heresy, I know, but I do think that game is objectively the worst Hitman game. Even worse than Absolution, which, okay, I'm not going to do that sound effect again, but, like, it's a game that not only has aged poorly, but honestly, isn't a good game. Honestly, Thief 2 and Tenchu 2, I'd recommend you guys play those if you want a good stealth experience. The original Hitman is so bad. It's so bad. Like, it was so terrible when I tried playing it. Again, what other game has ever used the keypad to move forward and backwards? Who thought that that was a good idea? So, yeah, no. And as for Baldur's Gate 2 and fucking Banjo-Tooie, it boils down to just those are just IPs I just don't care for. I never really cared for Banjo-Kazooie as much as, like, a bunch of other people did. And, well, here's the thing, even if I did like it, guess what? There still wouldn't have been enough platformers for me to find. That's how bad it got as far as platformers. There was only 2 games. So, and, well, because of the Pinkerton situation with Magic the Gathering, I don't want to touch a single thing related to D&D or Magic the Gathering. Because, again, Wizard of the Coast is the fucking worst company ever. Again, if you hire mercenaries, you're a piece of shit. Watch the 2023, our first episode, I'm not going to repeat myself. So I know that was 2 decades prior, but I don't want to give my money to a company that's willing to send out mercenaries to people, because that's fucked up. So, but either way, that was the stream. Thank you guys for watching this so much. Again, I'll make sure to, like, once this gets uploaded onto YouTube, I'll try to edit it down, so that it's not weird. But yeah, either way, I gotta, like, finish up packing, because again, I got my bags, like, right down, like, okay, you guys can't see it, it's like behind the thing, but yeah, I've got like 2 bags back there. I hope to see you guys in Los Angeles if you guys are either from there or you guys are just visiting for Comic-Con. I'm excited for it. So, and I'm pretty excited. So, because of that, of course, I will not be doing any content on Twitch until at least Tuesday. I might do a stream on Monday, but that depends on how much energy I have. But I don't know, I'm pretty excited. So, but either way, I will be posting a lot of like YouTube shorts and TikToks though throughout the entire thing. So, because I'll be doing this like Cooper cosplay, and I'm excited for that. But in any event, I hope you guys did enjoy this. If you guys did, make sure to hit that follow button down below and turn the bell icon so that you'll be notified exactly when I'm streaming. Like, guys, I added, make sure to check out links down below as well, specifically Discord, SoundCloud, YouTube, all that fun stuff. If you're watching this on YouTube, of course, hit the subscribe button and turn the bell icon. And if you want to directly support me, you can also hit the subscribe button on Twitch. If you can't necessarily do that, that's completely fine. I'm just glad that you guys took time to watch this. But regardless of all that, though, make sure to share the stream with other people as well, and continue to be awesome people in the process. But until then, I'll see you guys on the 1999 list. If not, another thing. Have a good night.